Hey guys, my name is Tensor. Welcome to another Flutter tutorial video. Today we're going to be looking at pagination, and we'll be looking at a widget called a notification listener. We're going to be covering pagination in Flutter because a lot of you guys have asked me to make a tutorial on this subject. Now for those of you who do not know what pagination is, I've got a nice little example here. This is written by another individual by the name of Tim, and I can't pronounce his last name, and it's essentially just an infinite scroll with pagination. The idea here is that as we scroll down, it will then go ahead and call to whatever API it's calling to get more of these pictures. And it'll look like we can just continuously scroll without interruption because the responses are hidden behind these pages. And you can see right here that they've actually got the pages numbered. So we've scrolled down 5 pages thus far. And once we hit the 6th one, you'll see that a 6th number will appear down here at the bottom. Now in our example, we will not have numbers like this, but we will be loading our data dynamically as we scroll down our list view. The API that we're going to be using is the JSON placeholder API, and we're going to be using the photos route because it has 5,000 items inside of it. Now the JSON structure for this is pretty simple. We've got an album ID, an ID, a title, a URL, and then a thumbnail URL. And we're going to define pages based on the album ID. And in this API, 50 items are labeled as number 1 in the album ID, and then there are another 50 in album ID 2, and so on. And so what we're going to do is essentially just pull in the JSON 50 items at a time, and then serve it to the list view. Before we get started with our code, we want to bring in a few imports. So we're going to be calling to the API, so we need the HTTP library. Then we're going to be building a block, so I'm going to bring in provider so that we can serve the block to our widget tree. And then we're going to be working with streams, so I will be bringing in RxDart. And all of these are using the latest version at the time of this video recording. Let's go ahead and create a class for our photos. Each one of them will have an integer ID, an integer album ID, and then 3 strings, one for the title, one for the URL, and then one for the thumbnail URL. So we've created a constructor. We then of course want to create a constructor, and then we also want to create a named constructor so that we can take this data and decode it from the JSON. And of course our named constructor will just take in a map, and then we'll just grab each of the items based on their respective JSON key. So ID will be ID, album ID will be album ID, and so on. With our model settled, we can go ahead and create our network API class. So I've created a file here called network.dart. I've imported the HTTP library, Dart convert, and of course our model. And let's go ahead and define our API class. And I'm going to put a string for the URL inside of it. And our URL is just going to go to the photos route of the JSON placeholder API. So what we want to do is create a function here which will return a future list of photo, and it will take in an integer for the album ID. If we quickly go back to our API, you can see here that if I type in album ID equals and then add a number, in this case 1, I'll get only the items from this specific album ID, and so this will act like our first request and our first page. So rather than pulling in all 5,000 of the JSON items, we're just going to pull in the first 50. So we want to go ahead and create a GET request, and what we'll do is we'll take our URL and we'll use string interpolation to add the album ID equals the album ID that we're passing in here. And of course we'll then parse that as a URI and pass it into http.get. This will give us back our response. Then we can take that response, pass it through our JSON decode function. This will give us back a list of map, and we can then go ahead and map over this JSON data and take each of the JSON objects, or each of the maps rather, and pass them through our photo from JSON name constructor. And then of course we want to pass this back as a list. Alright, so now we have our model and our network set up. Let's go ahead and create our block. So I've created a file here called block.dart. I brought in the Dart async library. I've brought in the Flutter widgets library, and you'll see why we need that in a moment. And I've also brought in our model and our network API, and then I've brought in RxDart. So we'll create a class here called photo block, and inside of it we want to create a few fields. First, we want to instantiate our API so that we can call it inside of the block. And then we also want to create an integer for our page number so that we can hold the state of the current page that we're calling from our API. Now for our example, we're going to need two stream controllers, and I'm going to use the replay subject from RxDart instead of just a normal stream controller for both of these. So the first one will be our output, which will be a list of photos, and we'll be passing this back to the UI, but we'll also have a sync here. And the idea is that the output of this other replay subject will be pushed into this stream, and then it will be converted into a list of photographs. This second replay subject is a replay subject of scroll notifications. Now, scroll notifications are essentially just notification events that we get back as we're scrolling through our list view. And we're going to use what's called a notification listener to be able to pass those events back to the block. The basic idea is that we want to find out when the list is at a certain point, specifically when it hits the bottom of our list. And of course, we want to take both of these replay subjects and close them inside of a dispose function so that we do not have a memory leak. Now we can go ahead and define all of our business logic inside of the constructor of this block. So we're going to directly call our API.getPhotos to pass this into our subject stream. So we can call subject.addStream, and then we want to convert the future from API.getPhotos into an observable, so we can use observable from stream to do this. And we'll call our API.getPhotos with the page number that we have up here. The main reason that we're calling this first is so that we get the first request from our API when the application loads up. If we do not make this call, then we'll have a list that doesn't have any items inside of it, and as a result we will not have any scroll notifications to listen on, and so then we can't make any further API calls. The main logic for our block is going to reside inside of this load photos function, and the load photos function will pass back a future of void, and it will take in a scroll notification. There are a lot of different notifications that we're going to get from our UI, so we want to check that we have the specific notification that we want to call the API. That way we don't overload and call the API multiple times without actually being at the place where we want to call it. So we can use the notifications metrics to find out where we are in pixels along the axis of our list view. And then we can see if that is equal to the max scroll extent. The max scroll extent, of course, is just the bottom of our list view. When we hit the bottom of our list view, this will fire off, and then we can call to our API. First, we'll take our page number value and we'll increment it. And we're doing this because we did originally call to the API first, above where we're going to call this load photos function. This is calling page 1, and then we want to call page 2, so we increment it first before we go ahead and call the API a second time. Then we can just take the list that we're getting back from the API and pass it into our subject sync so that we can then serve it out to the stream. Finally, we want to tie our two streams together, and we can do this by adding a listener to our controller replay subject. And this will just take each of the notification events that are being passed through this replay subject and pass it into our load photos function, which will then of course call to our API and pass the data into our other stream. There are two more items that we want to add to our block. So we want to add a getter for our stream. So this is just the subject stream. And then we want to add a getter for the sync for our controller. So the sync will allow us to pass in scroll notification events, and then the stream will allow us to receive the lists of photos from our API calls. Alright, so now we have all of the backend finished for our application. Let's go ahead and build the graphical user interface. We need to bring in the model and the block, and of course we also want to bring in provider. Let's first start by injecting our block at the top of our widget tree. So we're just going to wrap the material app inside of a provider widget, and then add a builder function which just calls to the photo block constructor, and then a dispose function which will just call block.dispose. Alright, so now let's come down to our My Home page, and this is going to be a stateful widget, though you could probably get away with a stateless widget if you wrote it properly. Inside of our state object, we want to define a few fields. So I'm creating a list of photo called photos, and this is going to hold all of our photos. And then I'm going to also create a list called MaxPhotos, which will be a list of integers. And we can use it to basically know how many items are inside of the API. We want to then initialize both of these fields inside of initState. So for MaxPhotos, I'm just going to call list.generate to generate a list that will have a length of 5,000, and it will have numbers from 0 all the way up to 4999. And then for the photos, I'm just going to set it equal to an empty list. Alright, so let's come down to our scaffold. For the body, we're going to create what's called a notification listener widget. And we're specifically looking for scroll notifications. So we can pass that in as the parameterized literal type for this widget. This widget just contains a child field and then a onNotification callback function, which passes back a boolean and takes in a function that takes in a scroll notification. Alright, so let's go ahead and create the onNotification callback function, and I'm going to cheat a little bit here and actually pass in our photo block. The function itself is pretty simple. We just want to check to see if the scroll notification is an overscroll event. This means that the user has tried to essentially overscroll the list view. So by filtering out each of our scroll events by overscroll notification, we can limit the amount of items that we're passing through our stream sync. So then we'll just take each of our overscroll notifications and we'll pass them into the block sync by calling blockSync.add. Then after we run our little if check, we're just going to return false from this function. And what that does for us is it makes it so that none of these scroll events from our list view will proliferate further up our widget tree from this widget. Now we can take the onNotification function and call it in the onNotification property of the notification listener. And of course for this we need to grab our block, so we can grab it by calling provider of photo block and then pass in the build context. We just want to create a small closure which will get the notification event and pass it into onNotification along with the block. The child of our notification listener will be a stream builder, and the stream that we're going to listen on will be our block stream. And of course this will just be type list photo, and then that means that the builder function will have the context and then an async snapshot of list photo. And so what we can do is then just return a call to a function that we'll build called BuildListView, which takes in the context and the snapshot. Our BuildListView function takes in the context and the async snapshot, and then it will return a widget. And the first thing that we'll do inside of it is check to see whether or not the snapshot has data. And if it doesn't have any data, then we just want to show a circular progress indicator. And if it does have data, then we'll create our list view, and we can use a list view builder for this. Because the list view will be growing, we want to specify the item count of our list view builder. So initially we'll have an item count of 50, but actually as you see here we'll actually have an item count of 51. and this will make a little bit more sense as we continue down. Item count will be a check to see if max photos length is greater than our photos length, which, as we know, our max photos is a length of 5,000, and then the initials photos length will be a length of 50. So if this is true, then we'll return photos length plus 1, which means 51. Otherwise, we'll just return photos length. Now we can go ahead and add our item builder to our list view builder, and we're going to output a list tile, or we're going to output a container with a circular progress indicator inside of it. So what we can do is check to see what our current index is, and check to see if that index is equal to the length of our photos list. It allows us to add a circular progress indicator to the bottom of the list when we're calling to the API. This is why we have a length of 51, even though our photos list will have a length of 50 on the initial call. What will happen is we'll have 50 items, which will be list tiles with our information inside of it. And then when we get to number 51, we'll have a circular progress indicator down there, which will appear until the length of our photos list increases because of our call to the API. Finally, we can go ahead and define how we want our data to look inside of the list tile. So we can go ahead and have a circular avatar with an image network, and we can use the thumbnail URL to add that image there, and that will be the leading item of the list tile. Then the title will be our ID, and then the subtitle will be the title of the picture. And there's one final thing I want to add to the app before we go ahead and run it, and that is this call in here. After we check to see if the snapshot has data or not, we'll call photos.addAll, and then we'll add in all of the snapshot data. And the photos list will basically act as an alias for our snapshot data, and it will allow us to keep all of the data from each of our API calls, so that even if the user scrolls down to, say, 2000, they can scroll all the way back up to page 1. I also want to go ahead and add a print statement to the top of our onNotification function so that we can see all of the scroll notification events that come through as we scroll through our list view. This way I can show you the different events that happen through the life cycle of a list view. There are two tiny mistakes that I made while coding this app. So I forgot to add the ParameterizeType annotation to the provider. So you want to make sure to add this here. So provider of photo block type. And then I also didn't add an initialization for the max photos. So when I called add all, you're calling it on a null list. The other way to do it, of course, would just be to set max photos equal to list.generate. And here's our application inside of the emulator. So as you can see, as we scroll down, we get all of the different scroll notifications, the most common of which is this scroll update notification. Then when we stop scrolling, we get a scroll end notification, and then we also get a user scroll notification. Well, let's keep scrolling till we get down to 50. And once we hit 50, you can see that we have our circular progress indicator, and then we get 51. And now we can continue scrolling all the way down to 100 before it will load again. And once we hit 100, you can see that it will load another page, and then when we hit 150, it'll go to load another page yet again. Now there is one minor flaw with the way that we're doing this. The problem here is that when we scroll through and we hit the edge of one of our pages, the user can actually issue more than one scroll notification of type overscroll if the API takes too long to load the page. We can fix this by adding a little logic to our block. I'm going to add another field here called pixels, and it will be a double, which I'll set equal to 0.0 by default. With this field, we can then come down to our load photos function and add an extra conditional to our if statement. So we're going to add this using an and we want to check to see if the pixels field is not equal to the notification metric.pixels value. And then after we call this if check, we want to take our pixels value and set it equal to notification.metric.pixels. When we scroll to the bottom of one of our pages, we'll get our overscroll notification, and let's say 2 of them are being sent through. The first one will come through and the value of pixels will be 0.0 or whatever the last page's max scroll extent was. And that value will not be equal to the new notification.metric.pixels value. Then we can use this to reset the value. So when the second notification event comes through, it doesn't pass this conditional and therefore doesn't call to our API. So now even if I scroll through here a lot and I pull up a lot on the list, it will not try to call the API multiple times and flood our sink with a bunch of buffered API calls. Oh, and by the way, just so that you guys can see, we've scrolled up to 350. This would go up to 400. If we scroll all the way back down, we still have all of the other values in the list. Alright guys, well I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the box below. And if you just like this video, then by all means downvote it as much as you like. If you want to catch other Flutter videos, then go ahead and hit that notification bell. Have a good night.